what we've seen in recent years are the ways in which, like, with so much diversity of our Jewish community, I think there's some danger also of like, so what do we do to actually bring everyone together? So as an entire community, I can't create a prayer service because we don't all pray together and we don't all say the same prayers. And I can't necessarily talk about God because we don't all have the same theological views. And we can't necessarily all do Shabbat together because that looks different for everyone, right? And so over the course of years, like what started to become, or the ways in which our organizations have united, has largely been around Israel. And so for a very long time, it was like the things that we would do as a wider community were around Israeli bonds or Israeli dancing or Israeli wine tasting, or right, this was sort of the thing that like the community could rally around. And as we started to see more shifts and more pluralism within that, I think we're also seeing a huge amount of pushback from people who find that their narrative around Israel is not becoming the sole narrative in the community around Israel. And rather than create opportunities for deep engagement or to really understand or encounter differences in different views, I have seen more and more people take to tactics to just shut down any other opinions and to make Jewish communal professionals feel scared that if they say something different, that they would face the same kind of harassment or bullying. And especially in a topic where I think the average person doesn't feel like they're an expert to go head to head with somebody else on this topic, nor should you be an expert. I don't expect everyone here to be an expert on all the rules of kashrut or an expert on any of the other things in Judaism. It's become much easier for people to just be silent. And I will say personally, and I think I speak for both of you also, I think the fact that I have not been silent and that I've been comfortable to speak about these issues and that I'm not willing to let those fear tactics silence me has really scared a group of people for whom that's worked for them many times. And I've seen things get really, really ugly in our own community.
Jim, what about you? What are the ways that this impacts you professionally?
Yeah, I appreciate, first of all, I appreciate everything you just said, Rory. And I feel like I come to this very question in at least two or three very different frames of mind. The first is a really overwhelming, profound sadness. And your words, Rory, really reinforce that sadness, that we as a Jewish community in this era have come to this. Because in my experience, this is something relatively new. I could hypothesize about the reasons why this phenomenon has really become part of our world in the last 10 to 20 years, perhaps. And I'm not going to go there quite yet, but perhaps later in our conversation, we will end up going there. But that's the first thing I feel. I feel an overwhelming sadness for Jewish communal politics, both locally and nationally and globally, and the impact it has on real people like you, Rory, and many others across the spectrum of Jewish life who, as Daniel said in his beautiful introductory words, literally fear for their careers, for their jobs, or endure profound abuse and bullying, even if they remain in their positions, secure or otherwise. So that's my first reaction. My second reaction, which is somewhat in contradiction to that, is that personally, I feel really privileged and the burden of a privilege, because I have to say, never in my career have I feared for my job because of the positions I've taken vis-a-vis Israel or anything else. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not true. I've had conflicts in my professional career from time to time, and worried, and we received professional feedback and guidance, but never have I worried that my position on Israel or Zionism would endanger my position. And so because of that, I come to this conversation from this position of privilege, and I recognize that my own experience is not the universal experience of so many of our colleagues and other Jewish professionals as well. And so I want to name that and honor that, because I'm not saying that that's because of anything special I've done or been. I've been very lucky to have been able to serve my entire career in positions where I was protected from the critique of those who you all are describing, who are abusive and bullying and intolerant of perspectives other than their own. But the third stance, I guess, that I am feeling that I'm coming to this today is with trying to understand it. And my first reaction is that it reflects a very dangerous and destructive politics that is bigger than just Jewish communal life in our society, in our nation, and in our world. That this is the face of it in Judaism. That the legitimization of bullying and of shutting down positions that make others uncomfortable and trying to wield the power of communal politics against individuals. This is exactly what we've been witnessing in our own country in recent years. And I personally believe, and while I don't believe it is exclusively the blame, I cast a large amount of the blame for this phenomenon on the right wing. In the case of Israeli politics and political impact on American Jews, diaspora Jews, I do believe that the vision of democracy and pluralism and tolerance and diversity are the authentic vision for the state of Israel and the historical vision. And I believe it is a group of people who represent a minority opinion, who come largely from the extreme right, who are trying to force a narrower, intolerant, and not diversity-focused perspective. And I think it's not legitimate. And I think the intensity of this that has impacted rabbis and Jewish professionals in America in particular is a reflection of the sort of the reactionary death throes of people who know that diversity is winning in the long run. So we're going to do everything in our power to squelch it. And I regret that, and I abhor it. And I am quite deeply committed to fighting against it, even and not at risk of my own position, because as I said, I feel so privileged that I'm never worried about losing my job because of something I said or did, although I've been criticized quite harshly at times. So those are sort of my three stances of feelings about this.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to return back to bullying in a moment, but first I want to talk about a phenomenon that I see nationally in Jewish organizations and hear your thoughts on how it impacts this discourse right here in St. Louis, which is that, look, the Jewish community is experiencing income inequality like every other community in the United States. And what this has meant is that a smaller percentage of Jewish families are paying an ever higher percentage of the overhead, or are enabling an ever higher percentage of the overhead and for Jewish institutions, whether we're talking about synagogues or federations or JCCs or whatever it is. But one of the pieces sociologically that goes along with this is that by and large, your ultra wealthy progressive Jewish families donate their dollars to universal causes. And your right-wing ultra-wealthy families tend to give to Jewish causes. And what this has meant is that particularly Jewish communal organizations, but it might even be true in a microcosm in each of our individual institutions, have a dynamic where the dollars that fund Jewish organizations are often far to the right of the Jews that they purport to represent. I'll go ahead and say I actually think that this tends to be the most extreme in organizations like federations. I think you find it almost across the country as a dynamic in federations. It has very little to do with the sort of individual local piece of it. So there's no criticism there of current leadership. How do you see this dynamic of Jewish dollars being far to the right of the Jews that organizations purport to represent? How does that impact this whole discourse and this dynamic?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I want to slightly disagree with something that you said, Jim, or maybe add a modification to it, which is that I agree that the phenomenon that we're seeing, I think, in the Jewish community is largely coming from more right-wing voices. But I think with the caveat of what Daniel added, that I think a lot of left-wing voices in our Jewish community have left. And so I think that that is to say that I think this is a tactic that also does happen on the left in terms of trying to control narratives. But I think where we are as Jewish communal professionals, we're not getting that push nearly to the same extent. And I think even in St. Louis, where I think that we still have a significant portion of the Jewish community who is heavily engaged in our institutions, who also identifies further to the left, many of them also, though, see themselves giving in addition. So they might give money to federations or to synagogues or JCRCs, but then also be giving money to Planned Parenthood, ACLU, and other organizations like that, that are kind of where some of them are kind of seeing some of their social justice work play out. And so that's going to be a very different way. Whereas I think I think you're right, Daniel. I think this is happening across the country. I think this has been documented. This is not something that we're not suddenly discovering this here.
No, in fact, I think St. Louis is in some ways more insulated, right? We tend to be significant. People don't appreciate this often, but we tend to be significantly more progressive as a Jewish community than most other Jewish communities, certainly of our size or in the Midwest.
Right. No, we absolutely are. And because institutions end up getting impacted by the people who get involved with them. So who's joining boards, who's getting involved? I mean, I think the money plays one piece of it. Also, there's a huge shift. The other added piece to what you're saying, Daniel, is that there's been documented shifts in the ways that donations are taking place right now. And so whereas a lot of our Jewish communal institutions used to prioritize trying to have the widest swath and trying to get representation from significant corners of the community. Now, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I mean, most of our Jewish communal institutions are being held aloft by, maybe 5% of donors. I mean, a very small number who are the significant donors, which means that our institutions can afford to lose some of the $100 or $500 or even $1,500 donors, but they can't afford to lose the $100,000 donor or the $1 million donor. And those people have huge impacts, whether or not they're even on the board. And then you also have board members who don't feel like they can afford to lose, that donation from the donor. And so donors coming into spaces and saying, I don't want to give money if this is a voice that's being included, or if you're going to acknowledge this in any way, or how leaders in organizations are courting donors and what the things are that they feel like they need to say, has made also a huge shift. So you have both members of the board and who then has a vote in policies or where organizations want to go, how they draft communications, all of that. And then also really a handful of donors who are driving any organization right now. And it's completely transformed how our Jewish communal landscape is looking.
Yes, and I just want to say, I think this is much more of a phenomenon in communal institutions that are trying to be inclusive of the broadest number of members of the Jewish community than it is of individual synagogues. I can simply say from the synagogues I have served, I can think of very few instances where donors of any financial level of capacity, whether it's small donors who are giving generously at the level they can, or very large donors who are giving significant larger sums, have been permitted to divert or redirect the congregational mission by their holding hostage their financial donations. In fact, I can think of a number of cases where quite the opposite happened, where the leadership of the synagogue, several synagogues that I've served have said, no, we're not going to take we don't want your donation if it comes with conditions. Whereas I think communal institutions like JCRCs and federations and other organizations that try to be more inclusive of the broadest spectrum of the community have a harder time having a consistent mission that is independent of the influence of donors. And, this is taking us somewhat afield, I think, of the discussion, but I think it's an important phenomenon. And again, maybe that's part of that sense of privilege that I feel. I've simply never had to, I've lost donors before. There have been people who said, well, then if that's the sermon you're going to give Rabbi Bennett, or if that's the position you're going to support, then I don't think I want to support the synagogue. But by and large, they have neither changed the mission of the synagogue dramatically, nor have they put at risk the institution or staff of the institution. They put at risk their own, well, maybe maybe this isn't the synagogue I should belong to. If you're not going to do what I tell you, you have to do because I'm giving you my money.
I'll throw in that as a rabbi at a 38-year-old, 40-year-old synagogue that does not have a significant endowment, I also believe things like endowments insulate leadership from those sorts of decisions. Organizations that are more dependent on this year's donations rather than 50 years ago, the donations, invariably, I think, inevitably, unavoidably, end up playing these games in a way that more financially insulated institutions don't. And look, sometimes it can be self-censorship too. That's a part of this too, the ways that this dynamic incentivizes self-censorship. But Rory, you look like you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Jim, did you want to make a quick point first?
It's okay. Go ahead, and then I'll add what I was thinking.
Yeah, well, I think, because I think also what Jim, what you're talking about though, is a strength of leadership. And I think that it's important to recognize that part of this phenomenon, Daniel, that you're bringing out for us is actually driving away exactly those leaders, right? So Jim, I think in the stories that you're sharing, some of it might be the nature of the different institutions, but I don't think that's only that. I think that it's also, what does it mean to be in an institution where somebody says to the board, we're not going to take this donation if this person is putting these restrictions on it. Or we're not going to take this donation if, I was talking to somebody recently who runs a national Jewish organization who said to me that he had met with a donor who had been a consistent donor for years, and the donor said some horribly offensive things about another population of people. And he said to the donor, I'm really just not interested in working with you if that's not what we're about. And if those are the things that you're going to say, then I'm just going to respectfully walk away from this. And did. And what impressed me in that was both the fact that this person was willing to do that, but then also had a board who was willing to stand behind him and say, and not say like, I can't believe you lost this 6-figure donor, but to say, yes, those are the values and that's who we want to be. And so what we're really talking about in this leadership, and what I think we're seeing and what I've seen, again, I'm not only speaking about St. Louis, we all have colleagues across the country. I see people who have that kind of leadership who are being driven out because they have board members or leaders who are scared, who say, no, you have to placate that donor or you have to placate that board member. And what's happening is that we're driving out strong leaders. And instead, the people that we're hiring are the people who, go back to the self-censorship that Daniel was just saying, right? They become kind of neutral about things, or I'm going to put out a statement, but I'm going to say good people on both sides. And I'm going to, talk about this, and I'm going to talk about that. And let me be really clear. I don't mean that to say that we can't walk a balanced line. I'm really proud of JCRC for bringing in a multitude of voices, and I think it's incredibly important. But I also think that we need to have values that we stand for. And when we're willing to give up on those values, then all we're doing is raising money to keep our institutions afloat. And we actually don't have any broader mission beyond just making budget for one more year.
Yeah, absolutely. I put an exclamation point on that, Rory, and agree with you. I also think that it's a matter of the willingness of institutions, including synagogues, to simultaneously work to be a large tent or a big tent that embraces a diversity of perspectives whilst also maintaining boundaries and limits to the opinions that exist in the big tent, and that we are, of course, we want to have everyone feel comfortable, but not if they break the ground rules of what it means to be part of a community. And that means not demanding that decisions be made because of wealth or because of power or because of influence, but that we return to our core mission, the mission of the organization, of the synagogue, the mission of the Jewish people. What does it mean to be a Jewish people? And in the case of Israel, since that's sort of what we started talking about, what is Israel's mission? And I always go back to the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, that our mission statement Israel's mission statement, our mission statement as a Jewish people, is an extremely broad and diverse and tolerant one. It is not an exclusivist or ultra-nationalist or a narrow one. And so when people use any kind of influence, be it financial or verbal or any other kind of influence, to dominate and force us out of our mission, it is, to your point, Daniel, it is a responsibility of leadership. Or Rory, you were the one who said that. It is the responsibility of leadership to say, no, let's look at our mission statement again. Let's look at our core values. And I think we have to continue to do that.
So I'm going to go to a comment from Michael Litwack in the chat here. He wrote, "The criticism by leadership and rabbis of the government and policies of Israel is perfectly legitimate and necessary, but isn't balanced with the accomplishments of the people of Israel, which I think," this is Michael commenting it, "which he thinks have contributed to the anti-Israel sentiments, especially of the younger generation." I guess I want to offer a different perspective on that, which is that at least my anecdotal experience has been that those young Jews that I know who at this point are the most anti-Israel, and there's some problematics with that phrase, but I'm just going to avoid those problematics for a moment. The young Jews that I know, 20-something, 30-something teens, who are the most anti-Israel are the people who were most fed the mythology without the problems. That actually I find that the people who were given nuance and are aware of the problematics of Israel, of the occupation, of the blockade, of so on and so forth, don't have that strong rejectionist streak in them nearly as much. Would like to hear your thoughts. I guess the other thing that I would say is my personal framing has become very much that Israel is doing and has done terrible things, just like every other state has done and is doing. And I feel like both of those are important. I feel like American Jews don't hear the first one nearly enough. And I feel like non-Jews don't reckon with the second one nearly enough. Israel's problematics, crimes, immoral, whatever words you want to put there, are very much no worse than any other country you can pick. I really believe it. The USA, Mexico, Algeria, Morocco, Jordan, Syria, China, Russia. It doesn't matter what you pick. It seems to be the nature of state actors. But both of those, and I feel like actually within the institutional Jewish community, the problem has been the lack of the first. So Jim and Rory would love to hear your thoughts.
I'm so glad you started to offer that perspective, Daniel. When Michael posted his comment, I had exactly the same reaction, and I'm sorry he had to leave, although I certainly understand his desire to go and be at the J with the community who are gathering there. But I had exactly the same reaction, which is the overwhelming voice of frustration, of confusion, of rejection of mainstream communal positions vis-a-vis Israel, is a rejection of, why don't you tell the whole story instead of always saying, but startup nation, but look at the amazing, not to take away from that. And I want to be clear here. I think the story of the accomplishment of the Jewish people in creating the modern state of Israel is an incredible story. But in recent years in particular, especially since the early 1970s, and particularly in the last 20 years, the story of the Jewish people in Israel is also a story of tremendous injustice and prejudice and intolerance and behaviors, as you said, Daniel, that are not laudable. And so to always say, no, but start up Israel, look at the amazing accomplishments of Israel, is not driving people away. Is not drawing the younger generation closer to Israel. It is driving them away, and they resent it and they reject it. And I agree. The conversations I've had in the last 5 weeks with young members of our community, be they high school students or young adults or college students, has been overwhelmingly people frustrated with the fact that we are not telling enough of the truth, and we are not being true enough to the humanitarian principles that are at the very core of the Judaism we've taught them, and the vision of Israel that they thought was the genuine vision of the state of Israel. And, for example, a refusal to call the occupation, a refusal to decry and criticize settler violence, much less the settlement policy of the Netanyahu government, on and on and on. And that's become more complicated in this war because it's more nuanced, with what's happening now in Gaza, with the right of Israel to fight a war of self-defense against Hamas, which is a horrifying terrorist organization bent on the destruction of the Jewish people. They are the genocidal institution here, not Israel, and the right of Israel to do its very best to free the hostages and bring them home safely. That's more nuanced and it's more complicated. But in the broader conversation, I totally disagree with Michael entirely on his analysis.
So I agree with what both of you are saying in terms of the level of nuance and the way that it shifts the conversation. But I actually want to talk about something different related to this question, because I think that the question itself implies that we're having a respectful disagreement and that we can have conversations about both what we think and also, even within the context of what I think, there's still times that I think, like, this isn't the time for me to say that part, right? So like what I might say to somebody in one setting is not what I would say to somebody in another setting. And all of that is, totally fair to have this level of discourse or to talk about the impact of it. What I want to really talk about is what it has meant to work in the Jewish community where people have decided that they have rights or ownership, or I don't even know if I quite have the right words, right? Like, it's not easy to talk about, but I feel like we need to get into some more of the specifics of this, of like, I have to say, like, look, I'm not from St. Louis originally. We moved here and fell in love with this community, fell in love with the day schools and with the people. And I have never gone to any parent events for any of my kids' classes. It's sort of like a running joke, like among other people, because I actually have no idea who the parents are of kids in most of my kids' classes. But it's because when my oldest was in kindergarten, I went to one event on a Saturday night, a social event, and the first person I met just like looked at me and like this, I introduced myself very friendly, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you're Rory," and then turned around and walked away from me. I have had to deal, and I want to give a lot of credit to Mirowitz because Mirowitz has been phenomenal. This is not a statement about Mirowitz at all. I have had to spend way too much time navigating with Mirowitz because of rumors started about my children because of me, or trying to figure out what spaces that, my kids can be in or can't be in because of ways that people have their opinions about the work that I do, times that I haven't felt comfortable, even at Base Abe, where I started by working there and then, felt like I couldn't just go and I couldn't just participate in prayers because I would be getting bombarded with people. Like, as much as I would say, this is my day off, I would love to have coffee with you on Monday. Can we schedule a time? Like, people who would not let me just participate in prayers. This past Yom Kippur, I said Chag Sameach to somebody who refused to even like look at me, like stared daggers straight ahead. these are the things like we're not talking about respectful disagreement or someone who says, could we schedule a time? Like, I'm talking about feeling like I don't have ownership over my own time and space, or that I don't get to just be a person who also has an evening free, right? A couple of weekends ago, I was invited to speak in New Haven, Connecticut. It was really beautiful. The congregation had they do this one weekend where it's two conservative congregations and a modern Orthodox congregation come together and host a speaker. And so I was in all three of the congregations, and it was just a beautiful coming together. And Saturday night they ended up adding a like Havdalah and song session. And I went to it, and they had so many people there that they had not had enough sheets with the words. They had printed out song sheets, and they didn't have enough sheets. And so I didn't get one. And it was fine. They gave me one afterwards. But like when I got there, they had already handed out all the sheets, and they were making more copies. And they started singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold. Now, I know the chorus of this song, but I don't know. There's like 8 stanzas, and I don't know them by heart. And I remembered having this moment where, like, first I felt like this pressure, like I needed to be mouthing words because I had become so entrenched of feeling like, God forbid, I was in the St. Louis community and we were doing something like that, and someone would see me not singing the words. And the next thing I would know is that all of a sudden there would be phone calls to my board members or to my donors, or there would be parents talking about, or whatever it is, saying that I did not support Israel enough because I wasn't singing this song. And I suddenly had to kind of stop myself and say, oh, I'm not there. It's okay that I don't know the words by heart. Like, I can join in the chorus, but I realized that's what I had internalized, because I have spent so many years looking over my shoulder, not because of self-censorship, but because that's what's been happening to me. I got sick and I didn't go to an event, and then people assumed that I was therefore boycotting a particular person, or a kid needed me so I stepped out of a room, and people are reading into every single nuance thing. And so I just want to be really clear in this conversation that we're having. We're not talking about what's the right time to have certain conversations, or where do we need to support Israel and where do we need to be critical, and what does it look like to do both. Like, when we talk about bullying and harassment, like, I am talking about feeling like there have been days and weeks where I constantly have to be, like, not just for me but for my kids, like, because like, God forbid our family doesn't look the way people want. Like, I don't look sad enough in this moment, I don't look joyful enough, because I then get not only calls, I suddenly find out that the Jewish Light was called about it. There's a letter to the editor about it. There's a petition about it. And you both know every one of those things has happened.
So I want to dig more into this phenomenon in particular, to think about the ways that each of us allows this bullying to happen within our communal discourse. So I'm just going to share sort of some of the pieces that I have personally experienced to give folks another taste. Rory, I appreciate you having shared that. I've had letters to the editor in the Jewish Light trashing me as being not pro-Israel enough based on my Facebook posts. Actually, I think those were from Facebook posts standing up for you and people who had trashed you, Rory, is the irony of it. That were so bad that the Jewish Light itself ended up running an apology letter to me for having run those awful things. I've had people write letter writing campaigns to local day camps that I was doing 15 minutes of music at pickup to try to get me fired from it. I have had Facebook conversations of local Jewish community folks who've talked about sending me to Gaza and let them take care of me. It is constant. We see people being disinvited from speaking at communal events because they're deemed not pro-Israel enough, even as they are mainstream or even slightly to the right of mainstream St. Louis Jewish views on Israel. It is constant, it is awful, but the phenomenon that I think is worth talking about is the fact that almost unlike any other issue, when these people behave this way in this bullying fashion, and they do it in the name of being pro-Israel, they are often rewarded rather than reprimanded by our community. If these same people, and let's be clear that often these same people are just sort of bullies in lots of different aspects of their life. If these same people tried to bully us about having trans kids, about all sorts of other pieces, it would be unacceptable and would be squashed in almost every corner of St. Louis's Jewish community. And yet the moment that they do it in the name of being pro-Israel, it is often applauded. In fact, to me, my understanding of this phenomenon is that it's a group of bullies who have realized that as long as they bully around this issue, they will be rewarded. So we're not going to change these bullies. I really don't believe it. But I do believe that our institutions, particularly, truthfully, our collective Jewish institutions here in St. Louis and across the country, it's not just here, reward these people and incentivize this behavior. So what can we, and I don't even mean just us as Jewish leadership, because I actually think it's much more powerful if it other people, polity. What can we do about this? How can we disrupt this awful and harmful and silencing and hateful and bullying dynamic?
I'm so glad you brought this subject to the surface, Daniel. I mean, the stories that Rory shares, that you share, that I've also experienced as part of in various ways, mostly in social media and also in a subtle undercurrent in communal politics. Being told, for example, well, two examples come to mind. Recently, right at the beginning of the war in Gaza, I think you both are aware of this, on social media, a Facebook post by a member of the more pro-Israel right-wing ultra-nationalist supporters of Israel in our Jewish community attacked the local St. Louis J Street chapter at J Street, which arguably represents, in spite of all the negative publicity that it has received in social media, probably represents the perspective on Israel of the vast majority of American Jews, which is just mind-boggling to me that J Street continues to be vilified. But a member of our St. Louis Jewish community posted on the local St. Louis J Street chapter page, you all, J Street, are responsible for the Hamas attack on Israel. That kind of ridiculous social media posting and the exclusive behavior of the Jewish community in terms of who participates and who speaks and who is respected in matters related to Israel is just absurdity. I think the answer to your question that occurs to me first is so self-evident that it is absurd and unattainable at the same time, is a refusal by Jewish communal institutions to permit social media to dominate the narrative in the official channels of Jewish communal life. And a willing, I was glad to hear you say that the Jewish Light posted an apology to you, Daniel. They shouldn't have ever posted the letter in the first place. There has to be a powerful...
Well, that's what the apology said, that they apologized for ever having run it in the first place. Yep.
Exactly. So there has to be leadership from the very top of Jewish communal institutions, the very top lay and professional leadership that has to have zero tolerance for this bullying and has to take a stance against it, even at risk, to your earlier point, even at risk of losing big donors who make threats, often idle threats, because I've always believed if you really care about a cause, you're not going to pull your money just because you're unhappy with something somebody says or does. But I really do believe it is incumbent upon professional and lay leadership in the community to set a tone that has zero tolerance for this kind of bullying behavior. We do not live in a community yet, locally or nationally, where that zero tolerance is actually, I think they would give lip service to it. Leadership would give lip service to this, but I don't think they actually believe what they say. And I think until the lay leadership and the professional leadership of the Jewish communal institutions, locally and nationally, actually say and live by it, all the energy that's going into, SRE training and awareness and, all this sensitivity awareness is really almost laughable if we don't actually behave that way in our own institutions and in our own communities.
I think that's beautifully said, Jim. I want to add a few pieces to it, which is that I think that the most important thing to start with is this conversation. I think we need, I'm so touched. I'm seeing comments from people saying, like, I had no idea. None of, like, that's kind of the whole point. It feels a little bit embarrassing. I've been with JCRC for 8 years, and it probably took me 4 or 5 years into my work with JCRC before I finally responded to an email from someone saying, I will not respond to the email until you speak to me respectfully. And for as long as you email me like this, I will not respond anymore. It took me years to recognize I don't need to respond to abusive emails. People who would call me names, people who would, let alone also on social media, all of that. But the same people who would publicly call me out in the newspapers or would send me offensive emails to my personal email account would then come and say, oh, you have to let us co-host this program because we want to be part of it, right? Or like JCRC needs to include the whole community. And it's taken me a long time to really say, you know what, we don't have to include these voices. But I think a lot of people, so what I'm trying to say is, one, like, a lot of the community doesn't know this stuff is going on because some of it's happening to us privately, some of it's public, or it's public in a small circle. So if you're in this institution, or maybe only if you're in my kid's class, might you know that this happened, but you might not otherwise even know that this is going on. But I actually say that I think a lot of our Jewish communal professionals, they don't even realize that it's happening to them. I didn't call it bullying or harassment for years. And even the story I just shared about being in New Haven a few weeks ago, I didn't even realize how much I have been uncomfortable being in the community until I was suddenly in this other community, and I experienced Friday night davening, this beautiful Friday night prayer service, and thought, oh, this is what it feels like. I texted some friends after Shabbat and I said, is that what it's like? Do you just go to synagogue and pray and you're not scared of who's going to yell at you and you're not looking over your shoulder? And they were like, yes, that's a normal thing that happens to people. And so I didn't even realize, right? Because some of these things, and that's part of the tactic, it breaks people down over time. So I want to really lift up that I think a lot of people, if you ask some of our other Jewish communal professionals, are they being bullied? I think they might say no. And then if you started kind of asking them more of these questions, or once somebody else says, do you know that that's bullying if you feel harassed or you feel like you can't go to the grocery store or you feel unsafe in spaces, then they might say, oh, hang on a second, I haven't really thought about it in that way. So I think we need to really lift up this conversation. We need to name it for what it is. And then I absolutely agree. We need to have this zero tolerance for it, but we need more and more people in the community to recognize it, because the other thing is that this is, again, part of the tactic is that people are framing it. And this is why I wanted to really shift that question you asked earlier, Daniel. People are framing it as respectful discourse. And if I then say that I'm uncomfortable, then I'm a snowflake, I'm a weak liberal, I'm just a whiny, like, whatever the narratives are, like, again, all these are being used, as opposed to recognizing the ways in which, like, people are specifically utilizing our Jewish communal institution. These are people who don't have power, but if they can get the newspaper on board, if they can get other institutions on board, then that elevates their power. And so I want to say just one other quick story, which is that years ago, this wasn't about me. I got a call from a reporter at the Jewish Light who was going to do an article about a young Palestinian woman who was involved in the Black Lives Matter protests. And they called me up to ask if I knew this woman. And she was this young, like, early 20s. I said, why does the Jewish Light need to run an article? She's a Palestinian woman who is being unabashedly, her identity in these spaces. Like, that's not a story. And the reporter from the Jewish Light said to me, 5 people called to tell me about this woman, and I never get calls from 5 people, so there must be a story here. And I responded to the reporter and I said, if I can guess all 5 people on the first try, will you kill the story? And they did. They didn't run the story. But my point was, because what I was saying back to him was, you think you're getting calls from all these people, and I'm telling you, these are a group of people who are coming together trying to rile you up. Like, if you are a member of a board and 5 people call you to complain about something, that doesn't mean, okay, freak out because this is a big deal. It means, let's look into it. Talk to the rabbi, the communal leader, talk to whoever it is, find out who these people are. Are all 5 people talking to each other? Because if it's 5 independent people, maybe you can say, oh, this shook things up a little bit. But if it's 5 people who are all friends who are trying to rile things up, don't play into people's games.
I would love the Jewish Light to run an article about the ways that 5 to 10 specific individuals in our local Jewish community are poisoning the discourse around Israel and around so many other issues for the entirety of the Jewish community, and the ways the communal institutions enable it. That's the article I would love to see the Jewish Light run.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there's another subtle form of this bullying. You know, there's the explicit bullying, which is abusive behavior that you all have both described. There's also another more subtle bullying, which Daniel, you alluded to, which is institutions and leadership excluding voices that are not towing the line of whatever the bullied perspective is, and excluding them. It's been interesting in the last 5 weeks to see which voices in the Jewish community have been invited over and over and over again into conversations about planning gatherings and speaking at those gatherings, and which voices have been completely excluded and at best have been invited to join as a participant, but not at the table from the very beginning. And I think that's a portion of this communal tolerance of bullying, or even furthering of bullying, that needs to be explored as well, and could be in that theoretical article in the Jewish Light you're alluding to.
So
we're approaching noon.
Yeah, I was going to say we are approaching noon, and the topic that we did not cover, and so maybe it'll be for another time, because I think these dynamics are not going to go away, are both the rise of anti-Semitism emanating from left-wing spaces, which I certainly have experienced more since October 7th than probably collectively up to that point, and the ways in which young progressive Jews in our communities are feeling alienated from mainstream Jewish organizations right now, and often staying away. So I think that'll have to be another discussion. I really appreciate today what both of you have said, the comments in the chat, and I'm really hopeful that folks who are listening have seen and heard the sorts of discussions that we often have as Jewish professionals behind the scenes, that so often are not had in public, because I think of many of the dynamics that we are talking about here. So hopefully we have truly lived up to our moniker of Behind the Curtain today. So thank you, everyone. Rory, Jim, any last comments?
I was just thinking, thank you both for your candor. It's really such a privilege to be able to have this relationship, to be able to speak so openly behind the curtain, or even outside of the curtain. And I do feel the need to simply add a very short prayer in this space. We haven't spent much time today talking about it explicitly, but my prayer is just drawing upon one that is so familiar to all of us, with a little twist, which is Oseh Shalom b'murmav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol Yishmael ve'kol ha'olam. May God, who is the source of peace, finally perhaps bring peace to all of us, to the people of Israel, to the Muslim community, the descendants of Ishmael, and to the entire planet Earth, because we are in dire need of that shalom.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Until next time.